Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Awareness Panel. We are having a few technical difficulties, but I am working on getting us streamed on Facebook and letting everyone into the Zoom chat. All right. So I am Sharia Burnett, and again, welcome to today's awareness panel about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This event is being co-sponsored by Family Abuse Services, Crossroads, This Woman's Words, the Kia Foundation, and Black Indians North Carolina. And with that being said, I am now going to turn it over to our moderator for this evening, Nikki Faircloth.
Hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. My name's Nikki Faircloth. I'm a North Carolina native. I'm Lumbian Tuscarora, and I am a co-director of a North Carolina-based nonprofit called Women Advance, and also a sister of Sigma Omicron Epsilon. I will be moderating this evening's event. I would like to introduce you to our panelists. Up first is Calvetta Watlington. Calvetta is a native of Alamance County. She is a tribal citizen of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. Calvetta has 10 years of experience working with both adult and child victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. She received her bachelor's degree in social work from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She's also a certified victim service practitioner and currently serves as the deputy director at Family Abuse Services of Alamance County. Our next panelist is Kimberly Knight. Kimberly resides in Raleigh. She's a graduate of North Carolina Central University with a Master of Social Work, and she obtained her license in clinical social work and is a 2020 honoree for the NCCU 40 Under 40 Award. She is the co-founder of the HIV Cure Research Day proclaimed by Governor Roy Cooper, and she's a contributing writer for Sheen Magazine, the editor of the Lux blog, and she identifies as a Black Indian woman whose father is of the Eastern Band Cherokee and West African Ivory Coast descent, and her mother is of African American, Halawa Saponi, and Tuscarora lineage. Our next panelist, Amina Ghaffar. Amina is Lumbee and Black activist from Pembroke, North Carolina. She studied biology at East Carolina University, where she also competed, and I don't even know how to say this, Amina, but I'm just gonna say, I am so intrigued all of the physical stuff you did at ECU, but she does still hold a school record at ECU. Amina is an advocate and focuses most of her advocacy on the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. She also works for the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs, and she's on the board of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women North Carolina Coalition. Miss Bria Miller. Bria's journey began in Taylorsville, North Carolina, where she learned to value family and community. She went on to attend the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. We're all like UNCG folks over here. I went to UNCG as well, where she studied political science with a minor in English and concentration in pre-law. She has a passion for social justice, which led her to pursue restorative justice work in court services, including mediation, juvenile work, restitution, and teen court. That's amazing. She's a volunteer coordinator at Crossroads Sexual Assault Response and Resource Center, and she strives to educate the community on human trafficking. And then Miss Sharia Burnett. Sharia was born and raised in Alamance County, North Carolina. She identifies as Afro-Indigenous and is a proud citizen of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. Sharia attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she majored in political science and Afro-American studies. In her spare time, she engages in projects and activities focused on women of color, children of color, and those identifying as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And she's also the one who organized this event, so thank you, Sharia. And so now I believe we want to dive into the statistics. Is that correct? Yes? Okay, great. So let's go over just a few statistics about missing and murdered Indigenous women in North Carolina. Now, there is very limited data because in our state, if a parent or a guardian or a family talks to authorities and says their child is missing or a loved one is missing, the police officer does not have to ask the identity of that person. They can assume that identity. So oftentimes what's happening, especially here, we have the largest concentration of Native Americans on the East Coast. However, a large portion of North Carolinians do not know that we are still here because they often romanticize what we're supposed to look like, which is a struggle. And so I believe a part of that is why the police officers aren't even asking questions about, well, what's the ethnic identity of this person that's missing? They often just assume that they're Hispanic, Black, or white. And oftentimes there may not even be an identifier as Native American, which is even more problematic. So the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women reports that 4 out of 5 of our Native women are affected by violence today. The U.S. Department of Justice found that American Indian women face murder rates that are more than 10 times the national average. Per the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, homicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among 10 to 24 years of age and the 5th leading cause of death for American Indian and Alaska Native women between the ages of 25 and 34 years old. And y'all, that's unacceptable. So I'm going to turn this back over to our wonderful panelists. And the way that I would like to do this is whoever would like to answer the question, you just let us know and we will put you on. So question number 1, what has been the impact of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls epidemic in North Carolina? And then in addition to these questions, I'll have some more for y'all from me when we wrap it up. Anybody want to take it?
I think it's hard to say. And I see everybody's face as we all ponder. We're all making the same face, eyes rolling upwards, looking for the answer to come down from the sky. And I feel like the reason is because we can't talk about the impact because people are not talking about it. It's kind of like individual conversations are happening in some tribes or in some tribal communities, but collectively, I don't think that there's really been a conversation about this being an epidemic in North Carolina. And that's part of why I wanted to host today's panel because, I went to Carolina in the years following my graduation. There was a citizen from Halawa who, was murdered, and it was not talked about as missing and murdered Indigenous women. It was just talked about as like a unsolved homicide, kind of like what you were saying, because the identifiers weren't really discussed. And if the tribe had not spoken out, I don't think most people would have realized that she was American Indian. It took the tribe announcing it as such. And so I think it's hard to gauge the impact because it's just kind of seen as little individual issues, if even an issue. It's not even like talked about as something that's really harmful, especially to the young women in our nations, like very, very harmful and very, very, I saw someone say that they noticed that cases go cold and they feel like it's not even really taken seriously as an epidemic. And so I think that's why it's hard to say what the impact has been.
Absolutely. If a lot of people don't know that the issue is going on, then they're not going to be able to get involved to help us. Anyone else like to add to that? Amina, Kimberly, Calvetta, Bria? And I'm realizing now I didn't have you all on my screen earlier, so I couldn't see if you were ready to answer.
Yeah, I'd actually like to jump in on that. And I think Sharia touched on a lot of important highlight points. But on the flip side of that, I think that the collective impact from an Indigenous perspective, like from our communities, and she spoke to kind of the frustrations of, not having as much attention drawn to what's happening in our communities. And I think that actually in the past couple of years, like seeing that Governor Roy Cooper has, declared and made an executive order or proclamation that it is a National Day of Awareness on May 5th, I think starting in 2019. I think that says a lot about people recognizing this as more of an issue now in North Carolina. And I will say that I think a lot of that has to do with the grassroots activists and, man, the family members of the victims who have been doing the strongest of advocacy through their tears and with all their strength, all the things that they're doing to raise awareness about their missing loved ones and demanding justice. And I think we have to say something about that for them bringing attention to it the way that they have, and through the fact that they're still grieving the loss of their loved one.
And I totally agree with that. I'll jump in here. It's Kimberly. I think when we talk about the impact, one thing we touched on earlier, Nikki, was about the identification. A lot of the issues we see, especially from a clinical perspective, is a lot of times people are reclassified or not identified correctly. And then you have the issues of the media not upholding that until people have to do a large speaking out, a march, or bringing attention to it on social media. And I think that's part of how our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are kind of in the shadows, where you're not being able to truly see the beautiful identity of who they are and what they stood for. The particular person we're speaking of, an honor giving to their family, and all if any of them are watching. She was a beautiful spirit. She was a very sweet person. And it was sad to the whole entire Eastern North Carolina community when the news came out about her passing and the way that she passed, and how the media just kind of wanted to sweep it under the rug about her community affiliation with the tribe, and just acknowledgement of Indigenous people, especially when you're from a state supported tribe or state recognized tribe. A lot of times you're not as seen as identifiable comparison to someone that may be enrolled in a federally recognized tribe. So I think that's why panel discussions like this brings more awareness. A lot of times people think there's only one or two tribes in North Carolina to begin with. They hear Eastern Band, Cherokee, and Lumbee, and they think that's the end for North Carolina for Indigenous people. But I think we have to definitely continue to make strong strides to let those voices be heard.
Yeah, and I would also say that, like, with this impact, the impact on North Carolina, again, has so much to do with the fact that so many folks are not recognizing and not acknowledging it. And I think that makes it easier for the violence to continue to perpetuate. Like, the less attention that something is on a particular issue, the more likely it is to, like, continue going on. People aren't seeing folks being held accountable and aren't seeing these particular patterns continuing on. So one thing that it makes me think of too is that it's almost silencing the hurt and the pain by the continuation of not acknowledging that these acts of violence are occurring.
And to piggyback on what Bria said, I also think that it makes people uncomfortable. Like, when you talk about anything that we've decided is in our past, like these things are not still happening, then it makes you uncomfortable when it comes up. And I mean, you know, Bria, Calvetta, I think all of us can speak to the fact that even just having conversations about domestic violence can be very difficult because people do not want to acknowledge that it exists. The whole reason that we have these power and control wheels to share with the community is to educate them, because there are people in these situations and don't realize that they're experiencing domestic violence. And so I think people's discomfort has caused the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and even two-spirited people, to just be pushed under the rug because they're uncomfortable talking about what that means about our society, what that means about how people value one another, and what it means about the justice system in North Carolina. And I keep seeing the same quote over and over again, where someone has said that for the women and the young girls who have been taken or who have been murdered in our state, the families have to continue to ask, if they look different, if they identify differently, then would it matter? And I think that's yet another issue that's going to make people uncomfortable, because nobody wants to talk about race or ethnicity as being a factor in news coverage, police investigations, all of that.
And I don't think we can ignore the way Indigenous women are fetishized. I think that has a huge impact on this epidemic, and why it is often ignored, because people don't want to talk about that part of it. And so I think that is a piece of it that probably needs to be brought to the surface.
Thank you all. Those were really good observations. I'd like to go ahead and move on to the next question. What are local tribal communities doing to make their citizens safer? Is anything being done by state or federal leaders? So what are local tribal communities doing to make their citizens safer? Is anything being done by state or federal leaders? I have a lot I could say about this, but I'm going to pass it to y'all.
Well, do y'all want the long answer or the short answer? I'll start with the short one. Tribal communities, some, yes. State, other than the proclamation, I'm not aware of anything specifically addressing the issue on a legislative level. I just know about the executive order acknowledging it, which in my opinion is great, but it's a little bit performative in the grand scheme of things. And then when we're talking about on a federal level, Sharice Davids and Deb Holland have been working so hard to make sure that things like the Savannah's Act gets passed, VAWA gets renewed, the Violence Against Women Act, which was amended in 2013 to include domestic violence victims, Indigenous domestic violence victims. And also, I don't have the literature right in front of me, so hopefully some of the other panelists can help me out, but these are a few things that the viewers can go and look at. And I think that there's a lot to be said about Deb Holland being in the position that she is in now as an Indigenous woman. But I definitely think that local tribal communities could do a lot more. I see a lot of women and grassroots organizers actually pulling most of the weight when it comes to this issue. And I'll be very blunt about that.
I mean, I think you're exactly right, particularly around grassroots organizations pulling most of the weight. And part of what's also kind of in VAWA and some of the changes around that are how specifically federally recognized tribes, what authority they have over prosecution of non-Native perpetrators, particularly around domestic violence. That is still why it's up in the air, but it still is nonetheless. There are some state organizations that have federal dollars that are trying to do a few things with Indigenous communities, not necessarily specifically around the missing and murdered Indigenous movement, but I think they would be open to it because they are trying to connect. And so one of those is, y'all, I'm gonna mess up the full name because we always just refer to it by its short name, which is FIPSA, which is the Family Violence Something Service Prevention. But they are trying to connect to Indigenous communities, and I think they would be open to some of that work in order to connect.
This
Really?
is, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amina.
I just wanted to add to Calvetta's statement real quick. I do work for the Commission of Indian Affairs, and in terms of like political views, they're my own tonight, but in terms of the Commission of Indian Affairs, we do have a FIPSA grant, and we did just start a Healing Circle program that addresses, and we're trying to create that space for the family members of the MMIWG victims.
Yes, and I was going to say to both Amina and Calvetta, thank you both for those comments. I agree with both of you that there's so much work to be done, and a lot of times it does fall on the nonprofits and grassroots organizations to be able to have that done. But I used to intern when I was in graduate school for the North Carolina Coalition of Domestic Violence, and one area they were really trying to work on is making an impact with Indigenous communities. And I hope that they are still, I know with COVID, everything happened, and it was kind of like soon as that project came about, we had the pandemic happen. It's early spring 2020, but I'm hoping that they, if any of them are listening, I hope that they are being able to make some strides, because we were about providing education and literacy to over all 100 counties of North Carolina to provide support to domestic violence centers and those who support domestic violence. But I think when it comes to the local tribal communities, whether federal or state recognized, I think the challenge many of us may feel in our hearts tonight is that if you have a seat at the table and your own tribal council, or you're able to be at tribal meetings, or you have influence in your tribe, this is the issues, one of the many issues that many people should be speaking up about. Last week, we just had on Black Indians NC talking about the importance of the matriarch society and for Indigenous women. And when we look at this, the protection of our women and girls is decreasing every year. We're seeing more and more that are passing away, and we're not even told exactly why. And I think it's important that that's a strong reminder to those of you that are able to serve in those capacities to please consider making this some type of formal program for your tribe. I know it won't be easy, but I do challenge for people to try to do that.
Thank you, Kimberly. Panelists, we will go ahead and move on to the next question. So what can the local tribal communities do to make their citizens safer? Are there any measures they can implement, any outreach they can do? What are your suggestions? If anyone's, tuning in from your tribe.
So
Calvetta?
in my opinion, what I would say is, first of all, stop being quiet. It's okay to take a stance. I understand wanting to be someone who, doesn't want to make waves, but our people are dying. We have to make waves. We have to take a stance and decide that we are going to protect our people and not care what other people think, not care what other people have to say about it. And sometimes that means that, we take a stance politically. And I understand that sometimes that can be hard depending on, nonprofit status and things like that. But when it comes to the health and well-being of our people, if we don't stand for ourselves, no one else is going to.
Absolutely. And it looks like, Sharia, were you going to jump in there?
I agree with what Calvetta said. And I think that sometimes, so I'm going to say this, not sure how it's going to be received. This is what typically happens when I start talking. So my thought process is we sometimes want to step away from anything that might be like a negative stereotype about our community, right? So you have people that may not want to participate in marches because they feel like there's this long stereotype existence that we're angry. Very similar to how some people talk about Black folks, right? So I feel like sometimes in an effort to be seen as acceptable, we let some things slide that we shouldn't let slide. And I think that sometimes that looks like us wanting to be well received. And so, well, we won't touch that yet. But the problem is, if you continue to put it off, it will never get addressed. There will always be a reason to not talk about it. And I feel like, I see several people in our waiting room and that are actually in the Zoom that are members of the Alamance County community and told me directly that they didn't even know that this was an epidemic. And we have a tribe here, and so my thought is, when we're educating people about our tribe, when they come to our tribal grounds for events, it could be as simple as having a booth set up for people to talk about this epidemic or to pass out information. If you are not comfortable, standing on a bridge with me and Calvetta and hollering and throwing waving signs and all that type of stuff, that's fine. But you could set up a booth at Powwow. You could co-sponsor or sponsor an event like this. You could bring people in to talk to the tribal community about this epidemic and about what can be done. And I just feel like the more you talk about it, the safer citizens will be. The more that you know that something is a threat or that something is an issue, the more likely you are to govern yourself accordingly, and not only to look out for yourself, but for those around you. And then more people that are not part of the tribe are also now aware, and they know to look out as well. And so I just think that not talking about it isn't doing us any service at all. It's not doing the victims any service. It's not doing their families any service. We can't be so focused on being acceptable and accepted that we accept mistreatment. I think that that's where the line is for me, is that I don't have to go and act a whole fool somewhere, but there should be things that I'm willing to act a fool about if need be.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree too. This is Kimberly. Thank you for that. I think that is so important. Awareness is big. Psychoeducation is big too, because a lot of times the issues we have in smaller rural communities and tribal communities is we don't have enough education about how does this lead to the person being missing or murdered. And we need to talk about human trafficking. That is real. Many of our tribal communities are next to large highway systems, whether it be Highway 95, whether it be 40, 85, even the more rural areas where you have more rural communities, there's still a lot of trafficking. Human trafficking is something we really have to address and talk about, that is real. And it's happening on a very, very consistent basis. And North Carolina has been in the slow mark when it comes to really handling human trafficking in our state. And I think that's something so important. When I worked in HIV work, we saw that so much with trans women of color, that they were being abducted or they were being murdered and missing, and no one really talked about it and said anything. And then there's just somebody pops up, passed away on the news, and no one knows a name or identity or anything like that, because they may have gone by a different name. And so that's where we really, with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we have to think about that. And also teaching self-defense, teaching our girls to, about awareness. A lot of things are happening on the internet that we need to talk about with our children. I say that from being a former educator as well. I've worked a lot of jobs, y'all. Telling my age now, right? But I'm just saying, with our children, we have to be aware and conscious to teach them too, because when they go away from that safe bubble of your home, there's a lot in this world going on. There's a lot online going on, a lot of coercion to minors, and there are a lot of human traffickers online posing as children. And we need to talk about that as tribal communities. There needs to be some real content panels like this, and even more things, even if you're not someone that may not be at a march, or like Sheree was saying, about whatever your activism rights may be, it's about really getting out there and spreading the word, for sure.
Amina?
2 words: exercise sovereignty. Exercise sovereignty. We have to remember that as Indigenous people, we have a political claim to the area that we are from. And even if we're state recognized, we still have a certain level of sovereignty. We need to exercise that. We need to put in place our own police forces. We need to put in place some type of protocol or programs. We need to use what resources we have as a sovereign nation to create these programs, to create our own system. And we can deal, if the state government has a problem with that, we can deal with that later in the Supreme Court, period. So exercise sovereignty, that's all I got to say about that.
I just want to high five Amina through the screen, like, for real.
Thank you. And I think, Amina, this brings up for me the cases of Rhonda Jones and Megan Oxendine and Christina Bennett, how Rhonda and Megan were both Lumbee, and Christina was heavily involved in the Native American community. And the tribe has really said very little about those murders. And those murders have become very high profile because of what activists and the families are doing, not because what the tribe has done or what the tribe has said, which is very unfortunate. And then, the way that these women were left with no respect. And just to give you a little bit of a trigger warning before I say, they all 3 were left naked outside, had been beaten, and the tribes decide to say nothing about it is very disrespectful to the women, and to the family, and to the community. So we can at least acknowledge those members that have been victims of these horrific crimes. So I'd like to move on to the next question, since we have about 15 minutes before we move into Q&A. How has this epidemic been overlooked as a trafficking, abuse, and domestic violence issue?
think Kimberly spoke to it a little bit just a minute ago when she talked about, we're not talking about what happens before they go missing. We're not talking about what happens before they're found murdered. We're not talking about the relationships that they're in, the problematic relationships that they're talking to their friends about, that they may not necessarily be talking to their parents about, but that they're, talking, because, we tell our friends lots of things we don't tell our parents, right? I know I do. And so it's that part that we're missing. I am often asked, particularly in this county, by people who either find out, who didn't know that there's an Indigenous community here. Oh, well, why don't they come, to your center? Is it not happening? I was like, oh, trust me, it's happening. But in Indigenous communities, you have to build trust before people are just going to come tell you about their story. And so I think trust is a big issue. And so we have to figure out how to build that trust within communities, how to have these, particularly young women, teenagers, how to create a safe space so that they have someone that they can talk to if it's not their parents, who when they find themselves afraid, that they can go tell somebody and not be scared that somebody's going to chastise them about a poor choice that they made, because who hasn't made a poor choice? And understanding that whatever has happened, if the relationship has turned violent, for them to understand that it's not their fault, and that there's somebody safe and somebody who they can trust that they can go to.
So I think that it's been overlooked in part because just off the acronyms that we use alone, we isolate it as something that's specific to our community. And I think that was done to give voice to the fact that it was happening. But I think for communities that are not Indigenous, what it looks like is that we separated ourselves from it, when in fact, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits are all three things: trafficking, abuse, and domestic violence. All three things exist in that moniker. So I think that we created the name to make sure that we gave voice to what was happening and to make sure that people were seeing what was happening to us. But I also think that allowed some people to create a division where, like, well, this is affecting your community, not everybody else, as if it's not an everybody else issue, as if oftentimes the perpetrators are not Indigenous people, as if this is not like a global issue on other continents and in other countries, but it gets treated like it's just y'all's problem that y'all need to address. And I think that until we have to claim it, we have to name it for what it is, because until we acknowledge all the different elements that go into it, we can't get all the proper resources, all the proper awareness, all the proper education. So we can't talk about women being missing and murdered and not talk about domestic violence. And like Calvetta said, people don't want to talk about it. We can't talk about, skipping over abuse, because oftentimes, to Kim's point about people being lured by people online, sometimes those children are already in abusive households. And that's part of what raises this whole issue of why you're looking for comfort on the internet, right? And so are we going to have a conversation about what some of our household dynamics look like as to why children are venturing out and finding themselves in abusive situations? And then also with regards to trafficking, too often we act like trafficking is only happening to one community and that trafficking only looks one way. I'm not pretending to be the expert, because that's why Bria Miller is here. I'm just saying that until we acknowledge how broad trafficking is and the many ways that trafficking shows up, then I feel like people will always be talking about MMIWG like it's this little separate caveat of situations, and that none of these other things apply. And as long as we don't acknowledge that they apply, then any legislation that's passed about those three areas really will get skipped over in regards to the terms and the policies in that legislation. So until we acknowledge it as such, nobody else is going to, own the fact that that's what this is, that all three things put together are happening to our community.
So many things, so many good nuggets there, and things I want to say as well. Even specific to trafficking, Sharia, you hit the nail on the head. It's part of it is talking about what this actually looks like, talking about the fact that there is sex trafficking, that there is labor trafficking, talking about the fact that whenever somebody is abducted, we need to be willing to explore that there could be more that's happening after that. It could be that this person is taken for the purposes of sex labor or other forms of labor, or for somebody to be a sexual servant. Like there's just a number of things that are there. But in order, again, to identify those things, we have to look at it as such. Calvetta, as you were speaking, especially about like younger folks and safe relationships and healthy relationships and things like that, I also thought about especially younger girls who go missing, but in the news headlines are just labeled as runaways. Or if we get their files as labeled as runaways, which is a way to be dismissive of it and to place the blame back on that child, when actually our systems need to be held accountable for saying, hey, this is a child who is supposed to be in this particular place, and it is our responsibility to find out where this child is and ensure that they are safe, that they are actually taken care of. Yeah, a number of things, especially even with like domestic violence issues and abuse. Cherie, you talked about like the power and control wheel and the fact that oftentimes it's difficult for us to identify exactly what it is that's happening, even if it is happening to us. If we don't know all of these different signs, then we can't identify that. So us coming together as communities and being able to share and have those levels of trust and talk to each other, I think is part of what's going to help to make it more safe and less overlooked.
That was an amazing response. Thank you so much, Bria. And clapping hands at it is all our responsibilities to make sure that, you know, children are safe regardless of whatever predicament they find themselves in. So since we have about 10 minutes left until Q&A, I'd like to, if possible, limit this next question to 2 panelists, if you don't mind. What is the mental health impact of this epidemic or of family violence against women and girls generally?
I'll jump in there.
Go ahead.
For this one, the mental health impact I know that I've seen, especially with previous clients, is long-term relationships, the trustworthiness, the feelings of self-doubt, anxiety, also insomnia, and fear of abduction again, if they're able to escape the situation that may have occurred. If they are completely missing and murdered, of course, the impact on the families. I have counseled people who have had family members that have had these instances occur. And I think it's one of those things where the stain that it leaves on the families and on the community, we have to talk about out loud. And mental health is one of those areas a lot of times we don't want to talk about in more rural or tribal communities, because that takes a lot of self-acceptance and accountability and awareness. One thing I remember very common was many people would always mention in some of those sessions I've done years ago was I saw the signs, but I didn't say anything. And the signs were there, but I didn't know how to approach my child or how to approach my girlfriend or my significant other when she was seemed stressed, or my sister when she seemed stressed with some things going on, or the last time that I saw her, revisiting that moment constantly. And so for the sake of time, I will say that impact definitely is an epidemic in itself. It causes a lot of things and confusion for a lot of people when it comes to that. And I think for healing our communities, I just want to definitely give a shout out to Amina and the great work that you are doing for the healing circles. I am very excited and thankful to be able to support that. You are a truly shining star, and I'm thankful for you so much for this, because we need it. I knew you were going to do that, because but I'm so thankful for you, my dear friend, because you're doing a great work that's going to impact so many people in the communities. And then also to Dr. Brittany Hunt, she's a doctor now, and to Chelsea Locklear over there at the Red Justice podcast. If you guys have not checked them out, they are bringing light to a lot of these cold cases and making us really think out loud some of our thoughts about that. So I think it's definitely this mental health plague that is taking over some of our communities. It's time for healing, and our land needs healing. So it's time for us to do some work and be accountable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I dropped in the chat the name of that podcast. It's called the Red Justice Project. If you would like to look it up, and those podcasts are free. You can find them on Apple or anywhere you watch podcasts. Would an additional panelist like to chime in on this question? Or would we like to move forward?
Kimberly nailed it.
Oh, she got it. Okay. All right. We'll move on to the last question. And then in addition to that, I have an additional question from myself for you all. So last question here on the slide. What can we do to raise awareness and to stop this epidemic from claiming more lives? Sharia?
Start with something easy. Tomorrow is the National Day of Awareness. So I encourage people to wear red. And when someone asks you why you're wearing red, I encourage you to tell them. And I don't want you to tell them in a pretty way. I want you to tell them that there's an epidemic and that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are being murdered and they're missing and there's not enough data about it. And it's as if they've disappeared. You can also, there are so many accounts on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, even specific to North Carolina, accounts of the grassroots efforts, of marches, of events, of educational information. If you search the MMIW hashtag or any variation of it, you can find them all. You will see a lot of people using the red handprint, which is pictured on the screen now. That is also an option. Support things like the Red Dress Project that travel throughout the nation and post, single or maybe 3 red dresses in barren land to symbolize the lives taken. And I think also make sure that you continue to attend events like this, because it's wonderful to have the support of different tribal communities and of people who aren't Indigenous at powwows, but we need that same type of support around this issue when it's not about having a good time and having a cultural experience or buying wampum jewelry. We still need your voices and your attention around this issue as well.
I would say one thing that we can do to stop this epidemic from claiming more lives is talking more about the fact that we need to be engaging with people in relationships in healthy ways, and less of us need to be harm doers, but instead knowing how to treat other people with kindness. And regardless of somebody's background, regardless of somebody's age, race, whatever, that is never a reason to treat someone poorly, that we always need to practice consent with people, and just acknowledge that they are human beings and nobody's body is ours to take and to just treat however we would like to.
Thank you, Amina.
Those are all excellent points. And I just want to give a shout out to Shatter the Silence in Robeson County and Miss Sheila Price. I think she's doing a wonderful job just keeping people in the loop about the different people who are turning up murdered in Robeson County and beyond. Her group has about 6,000 members now. And she's lost, Rhonda Jones was her daughter, and she's been doing so much to use the group to heal herself in a sense, and gathering this sense of community. And I also want to say that tomorrow in Pembroke, if you're from Robeson County, there will be a MMIW march and we'll set up a booth out there at 5 p.m. But there's a march that starts at 6 p.m. and it'll be in the town hall, right beside Burger King and across the street from that gas station over there. I can't remember the name of it, but a few of the council members and some of the members of the community actually organized it, and this is the second year that they're having it. So shout out to the people who were doing that initiative down there, and I'll be there too. And there's another event tomorrow night. GCS is doing another panel at 6 p.m.
Yes, I was just about to say that GCS panel is happening tomorrow. Shout out to Stephen Bell over there at GCS, and everyone out there. I definitely would say for raising more awareness, many people have spoke about really great things to do, but also another thing I'll say is if you see something, report it. If you feel that something needs to be reported and you really feel uneasy about it, please report it. Don't wait or hesitate. We understand that sometimes you may not feel as comfortable to get involved or feel like it's not your issue or your problem. But if you do seriously see something, please do report it to the authorities, because you can save someone's life today and keep someone safe. And definitely supporting these initiatives and things that you see, stand in solidarity for all the events and upcoming programming that's going on. And please be inclusive to Afro-Indigenous women, because they are Indigenous too. And sometimes they are silenced as well and not accounted for as well. So please be supportive of that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Kimberly. Do we have any other thoughts on this question before we move into the last one? All right, and this question is for each panelist, so I'd like each of you to answer this very briefly if you can. What is a case of NC MMIW that's had a particular impact on you? And I'm sure this won't be hard for y'all, but please, as it comes up organically, speak.
I definitely say Faith Hedgepeth, because that was right there in Eastern North Carolina where many of my family is from. And that's something that, even though there have been programming where it made it to 2020 and it made it to a lot of national programming over the last 10 years nearly here, it's still impacting the community, especially Eastern NC. And there's definitely been an impact there, and so many unanswered questions and concerns about the person that murdered her being still at large. So that had a definite impact for sure.
Kimberly actually beat me to it. I didn't know Faith personally, but I know a lot of Faith's friends. And so to watch the pain that they have had to endure has been painful. And to even see that it was not portrayed as an Indigenous woman murdered, it was, I mean, and the lack of care, honestly, that it felt, at least from this side of it, that it just didn't seem like there was a lot of care happening from the law enforcement and the school perspective. So that has definitely had its weight on me.
Faith Hedgepeth automatically comes to mind for me, primarily because, like Calvetta said, I had just graduated from Carolina, and so a lot of my classmates and friends were friends of hers. And I did not know her personally, but there was a lack of care. I was very disappointed in the university and how the coverage of all of it went. Like, and I felt like we had another very prominent death that occurred of a young white woman, and it was treated completely differently. And comparing those two experiences was hard for me, especially when I learned that she was Indigenous, because in the midst of my classmates, my friends being very upset, again, going back to that question that I talked about earlier, seeing this complete example of how y'all could have done better because you did better by this person. So what was different about this situation? And what made it, why did you feel like you didn't have to offer care and you didn't have to do as thorough of an investigation as you could have, and you didn't cover it on the media the same way you did these other cases? I just felt like it presented so many questions, and I felt like people were grieving. And so even when they had those questions, they didn't feel comfortable asking them, because I think they kind of secretly already knew the answer and they weren't prepared to hear somebody say it. And I think that a lot of people felt like they were being lied to. And I think that is very hard when all of you are at that school or came from that school, and you're supposed to believe that you are a family, and you see a member of that family taken, and it's just kind of glossed over.
I think that, well, I'll just name the ones that I have a relationship to in Robeson County, and I'm going to say their names: Katina Locklear, Rhonda Jones, Christina Bennett, and Megan Oxendine. And I've been doing this advocacy since my first time speaking about it was in 2017. And the first speech that I gave about it, I sobbed when I said their names. And they all happened around the same time. And I went to school with Megan Oxendine's sister, and I still talk to her often. And I think it's important when we're talking about this, when we're talking about cases, that we remember that the families are always going to be affected by this. And it's important, even when it's uncomfortable for us as people recognizing they're grieving, to still reach out to them and check in and see how they're doing. And I think there's a lot of fear around that, but we have to overcome these things because their pain is our pain. And so we share that together. We hold that space together. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Amina. Bria, is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess the best thing I could add at this point, which is actually really sad, and a lot of the reason why we're even here today, is that what really stands out to me is the fact that I haven't heard so much about these particular stories. And the headline has not been that these were missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I think the lack of that attention and the lack of that awareness speaks volumes to the depth of this issue right now.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move into Q&A. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask, please drop it in the chat. If you're on Facebook Live, I'm not sure. Are we just live streaming to your personal page?
It's on my personal page, but it's public, so people can share it.
They can share it. Okay.
And
So if anyone,
if you drop the comments, we'll respond to those after the fact, unless they come up while I'm looking at my phone.
got it. So we'll give you a moment to drop in any questions. I did want to mention that every year, Governor Cooper does release a proclamation on North Carolina missing and murdered Indigenous women. And usually he says that number is over 99 MMIWs, and that number is wrong. From the advocacy work that groups are doing on the ground, for example, Shatter the Silence, they have discovered that there's over 200 cases and counting. So it looks like we have our first question from Stephanie Baker. How do colonialism and racism factor into the present day reality of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? So again, how do colonialism and racism factor into the present day reality of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? Sharia?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Baker. That is so fitting. I knew you would ask something like that, and I love it. So I would say specifically to the colonialism aspect, it's because from the time the first colonizers stepped foot on this land, we were seen as people that could be taken for whatever reason they saw fit, and people that could be overlooked. And at a certain level, people that if we were harmed, people would not miss us when we were gone. And I think that that thought process, even if not automatically, even if it doesn't automatically come to mind, I think it still exists for some people. And that's why this isn't talked about, because those things have been assigned to Indigenous women, if you will. And I think Calvetta is who mentioned it earlier about how people have fetishized us. And I think that that goes back to colonialism, and it comes full circle right now as to why it's continuing to happen. And people feel like they don't have to talk about it and that they can just move past it like it's not an issue.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything else to add? Amina?
Yes, I think Sharia brought up a great point, but I also want to offer into the conversation, even before the colonizers arrived, the doctrine of discovery was issued in the 1450s, and that was issued by the Pope, and it was a proclamation that gave conquistadors, colonizers permission to, in the name of their monarchs, go to indigenous nations across the world to subdue, colonize by any means necessary indigenous populations and convert them to Christianity. So we have to be very candid about that. And we have to also remember that this document has been cited in our court cases and the Supreme Court as recently as 2005 to deny indigenous people their claim to land. So also when we're talking about the violation against our bodies and we're talking about colonialism in this context, we also have to remember that our land, Mother Earth, is also part of this construct of violence against indigenous women. And so that document still sits in our Supreme Court. It was set precedent in Supreme Court case, some Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823, and it's what launched the Manifest Destiny. So this is very clear cut in history, and these acts of genocide are still happening today, and colonization is ongoing. It has not ended.
Thank you. And also, you know, with colonization, it exists to erase Indigenous identity from using percentages of Indigenous blood or pure blood, quote unquote, to taking over land. So, you know, you erase people by blood quantum, and now you erase people by not even talking about their cases or acknowledging that they are Indigenous is a big problem and definitely contributes to that. And Stephanie says, yes, that historical context is key. Appreciate hearing that for Amina. Any additional questions before we wrap up?
Nikki, I just wanted to address Dr. Baker's question with regards to racism. So I think that we talked about earlier how sometimes in some situations, they don't even identify people as Indigenous. That's not even a conversation that's had with the family when they report the person missing. So I think there are aspects of racism in that. And I could go on a tangent about forms and why enough forms don't have American Indian as an option, but I'm gonna let that go for right now.
All right. If there's no other questions, would we like to move into any closing thoughts from our panelists before we wrap up? If you have any closing thoughts, feel free to unmute.
I'd just like to say I am so grateful to each of you and grateful to the people who showed up both on Facebook Live and here. I have learned so much and I'm so excited to have met particularly Amina. Kimberly, I've seen you kind of going through on Facebook. Amina, I have never met you and I'm so excited to have connected. And I am so just proud of the work that we all are doing to help our tribes, and our ancestors are proud, I think, of the work we're doing. And so I would hope that should any of us need anything, that we can call on each other. Bria and Sharia are already excused because I call on them all the time. So I am grateful to know you all.
Thank you so much, Calvetta. Yes, you can call on me. I would love it. Feel free anytime. It was a pleasure being here tonight with everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me for this opportunity to share. The work that I do for Black Indians NC is truly my passion work. And I think that bringing more people from different communities, especially tribal communities, together is able for us to really get a lot of these issues out. And even though it's been tough that we've been on the inside with the pandemic, I will say I'm thankful for these virtual talks happening more now than they ever have. And we're bringing more light to issues that we need to talk about out loud. So I would like to say thank you all for having me tonight. And it's been a wonderful pleasure. And I look forward to more great works for each of you. Thank you.
Any other closing statements?
Really briefly, I just want to bring into the conversation the lateral violence that I've seen in our communities. and how it's impacting the effectiveness of us being able to work on issues like missing and murdered Indigenous people. When I said those 4 names, I said the name of a Tuscarora woman and I said the name of 3 Lumbee women. And all of them are my sisters. All of their relatives are my relatives. In North Carolina, we're all related. And it's hindering our progress on this issue to look at each other, no matter what color their skin is, and be like, you're not my brother because you don't look like how you're supposed to look like. We should not be looking at each other as strangers. We need to be looking at each other as community, and we need to be working together to resolve issues like this. And we have to realize that all of this racism, this hatred that we have in our own communities is a product of white supremacy. Let's not get lost. Let's not get caught up by missing the big picture that colonialism is even a product of white supremacy. So all of these things go back to, we all have the same fight to fight. So we got to get over our issues and we got to come together and we got to fight. So warrior up, let's get it.
As Audre Lorde says, there's no hierarchy in oppressions. And so the more we realize that, the more we embrace that, the more work we can do together to fight.
So Amina, I might have to steal warrior up. That I might have to take that. Thank you for that, because I needed that. So I just want to thank everybody on this panel. For those that I did not know personally, recommendations were made, and I appreciate every single person that made a recommendation, because this is what this conversation needed to be. This is better than I could have even imagined. And so I appreciate the recommendations. I appreciate the people on this panel. Calvetta and Bria and Kimberly, I'm familiar with y'all. Y'all know you can call me for whatever. But Amina and Nikki, just know, whatever the fight is, if I can't be there in person, I'm gonna be there in spirit. Just let me know what I need to do. And to everybody in the audience, I know that we have students here from Elon. We have some faculty from Elon. We have some people that are community members or that are citizens of other nations. I just want to thank you all for being here. And I want to remind you that when we have these conversations and it feels overwhelming, when it feels like there is nothing you can do, remember that you showed up, and that's already a step in the right direction. Just continue to show up. That's what we need you to do. Nikki, you did a beautiful job moderating. Thank you so much for asking this final question. And just one more last time, can y'all please remember to wear red tomorrow and tell people what you learned today? Thank you.
And panelists, if you would just stay on, and Sharia will stop live streaming shortly. Thank you all for your participation.